Episode 12, Early Latin America. Question 1. Why did Spain and Portugal have a familiarity with slavery that other European countries did not? Though slavery was prevalent in the Roman Empire, estimates range from 10 to 20% of the empire at its height in the mid 2nd century CE. By the time of the collapse, the transition from chattel slavery to rent or labor obligations was underway, laying the groundwork for feudal serfdom. Most of Western Europe was thus unfamiliar with slavery, not so Spain and Portugal. There was a relatively brief period between the last Roman presence in the Iberian Peninsula and the Muslim expansion northward from Africa. During this time, the region was ruled by a people known as the Visigoths, Christian nomadic invaders who had sacked Rome in 410 CE and who established a kingdom encompassing southern France and the Iberian Peninsula. The whirlwind Muslim expansion beginning in the 7th century eventually came to encompass the entire Iberian Peninsula. Though obviously a minority early on, Islam became the majority religion around the 9th century and remained so for centuries. Even when internal squabbles contributed to the fragmentation of the Muslim state, Muslims were a significant plurality in much of the region up until the 13th century. There is a strong argument that the eventual defeat of the Muslims at the hands of the Ferdinand and Isabella Castilians was more of a Christian expansion into Muslim territory than it was a quote-unquote reconquista. Muslim culture and tradition were thus deeply woven into the fabric of the region. Slavery was deeply integrated into the economy and society of the Muslim world, and so of all the parts of the Western Christian world, it was the Iberian Peninsula that had the most familiarity and comfort with the concept of slavery. Crucially, and tragically, slaves as a trade commodity was on Spanish and Portuguese minds as they first expanded across and down the Atlantic, laying the groundwork for the transatlantic slave system. Question 2. Describe the encomienda system. Did this mimic a pre-existing European model? The encomienda system was in many ways identical to European feudalism, or at least the Spanish feudalism that developed during the so-called Reconquista. Traditional European feudalism evolved from a mutual obligation between peasant and lord in the years after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The encomienda system that evolved as the Spanish took control of Muslim territories had no such basis. Instead, the crown would reward nobles and soldiers with supervisory rights over a newly conquered region. The peasants would not be the property of the encomiendero, and the land still technically belonged to the crown, but they still had the right to collect tribute and command service. In return, the encomiendero owed loyalty, defense, and Christianization to the crown and church. Though not identical to traditional feudalism, in practice it functioned in essentially the same manner. When the Spanish began their conquest of the Americas, they simply employed the exact same system, subordinating native peoples in the place of Moorish peasants. Question 3. Describe the rise and fall and rise again of the economic fortunes of the Caribbean under Spanish rule. How does this illustrate the overall Spanish colonial endeavor? The first waves of Spanish conquistadors were obsessed with gold. In the earliest decades, significant deposits were found on the islands. The amounts found would be paltry compared to later discoveries on the mainland, but were enough to enrich the earlier arrivals and inspire subsequent expeditions to the mainland. The island gold was quickly exhausted, and the local economy collapsed. As mining waned, Spaniards imported the sugar plantation model from the Canary Islands and Madeira. For a century, the Spanish reaped significant gains from the production of sugar for the European markets. Competition from British, Dutch, and French sugar colonies drove prices down eventually, and with administrative focus distracted by the silver boom, the plantations, the Caribbean, became peripheral. It was no longer the export dynamo it had been, and its economy settled into a mixed model: cattle ranching, tobacco, ginger, and small-scale provisioning for fleets and garrisons. The result was less spectacular profits, far fewer enslaved workers, and greater economic stability. A genuinely Creole society began to form, smaller, poorer, but more sustainable than the extractive booms that preceded it. Question 4. Describe the typical conquistador. In what way would these people assert themselves as a noble class in the New World? Few of the conquistadors were professional soldiers, and far fewer were aristocrats. In general, conquistadors were fortune seekers, men who sought glory and status that would have been otherwise unobtainable back in Europe. Treasure would have been the primary motivator for these men, and though some were able to enrich themselves in that way, most were happy to accept an encomienda. The role of encomiendero back in Spain was filled by Spanish aristocrats, but aristocrats were generally not conquistadors, and so the award of an encomienda naturally elevated men who would have been looked down upon by European elites. These adventurous men, many of humble origins, came to see themselves as a new nobility entitled to dominion over a new peasantry, the Native Americans. Question 5. What changes illustrated the shift from conquest to colonization? Naturally, the violent, brutal, and dangerous work of conquest attracted a certain kind of personality, and the looming prospect of diving into the unknown would have deterred most Spanish citizens. Conquest is by definition a messy business, and there is little time to rest on one's laurels, so there was little in the way of comfort or niceties. In this wildly unregulated and fluid context, fixtures of established societies such as churches and schools are not a priority. The frontier is not a place for the niceties of civilized society, and as such is not suitable for families and culture. As the frontier moved deeper into the Americas, the conditions in the more mature colonies improved, and with the extraordinary wealth that started flowing from the silver mines on the mainland, the major populations began to bear a closer resemblance to those back in Europe. When the women and children show up, it's time to shower and tidy house. Question 6. How did the demographic collapse amongst native populations in the 16th century contribute to the breakdown of traditional social and economic structures? The introduction of a variety of non-native diseases had a catastrophic effect on native populations, resulting in a 90% death rate, according to some estimates. The tragedy unfolded not just as a loss of life, but also the death of much of native culture. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, the same principles of indigenous agricultural organization could be found throughout Meso and South America. First and foremost, land was held communally, by community, lineage, or clan, but not by individuals. Families had quote-unquote use rights, not ownership. They farmed a plot assigned to them, but could not sell or subdivide it. Stewardship rather than exploitation was the norm. People were caretakers of the land on behalf of the ancestors and future generations. Farming was done by extended families, households, or community work parties. Reciprocal labor systems, where members helped one another at planting or harvest, were common. When Old World diseases ravaged the native populations, there was a complete cultural and economic collapse. If a communal farm system loses 50% of its workforce, this does not translate into a simple 50% reduction in output. It is far more likely that there would be a 100% collapse. The practices of one of these communal farms would be highly successful, but only when all the moving parts are in unison. Take a Roman galley as an example. If it requires 100 men to operate at full speed and it only had 90 men, it might very well be able to move at 90% speed. But if the number was reduced to 5 men, the result would not be a 5% speed. With numbers that low, they wouldn't be able to move the boat at all. There was a minimum population necessary for these communal farms, and when the numbers dropped below that, the farm became defunct. With these decentralized farming communities now unworkable, the surviving populations concentrated in either the nearest hacienda or nearest town or city. Once there, Stripped of their ties to their clan lands and lumped in with all of the other economic refugees, their traditions, languages, and culture would be lost to the melting pot. Question 7. What caused the shift from encomienda to hacienda as a source of wealth for Spanish colonists? As previously discussed, the encomienda system started with the Spanish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, with nobles being rewarded for their service with feudal authority over newly captured territory and the peasants living there. The noble would then be entitled to the wealth generated on that land, mostly through agriculture. The economic activity was thus spread out, decentralized in a characteristic fashion. The wealth of the encomienda relied, therefore, on the product of peasant labor working across the extent of the territory. This model initially worked in the Americas. Spanish nobles would tax or otherwise extract value from the farming communities that largely predated the Spanish arrival. The massive depopulation caused by the introduction of Old World diseases crippled the encomienda system. There was no longer a large enough decentralized population sufficient for the scale of agriculture necessary for generating wealth. Consequently, the reduced populations drifted to central locations, and instead of widespread decentralized farming, they intensively farmed mostly cash crops in a more concentrated area. The result was a plantation, or hacienda. Question 8. How did an over-reliance on silver mining lead to a decline in Spanish power? In general, the supply of American silver to Spain was consistent and continuous, and made the colonies appear worth the effort, but the reality was far more complicated. Most of the wealth immediately flowed out of Spain to pay for Spain's European wars, its long-term debts, and the purchase of manufactured goods to send back to the Americas. Probably less than half of the crown's silver remained in Spain itself. It was the purchase of manufactured goods that most clearly illustrates the inherent weakness of the Spanish economy. The mercantilistic model relies on colonies as markets for manufactured goods. Because the Spanish never developed a domestic manufacturing capacity, and why would they feel the need to with all that silver, they essentially handed over the benefits of their colonies to their rivals, the Dutch, the British, and the French. The fundamental laws of economics added further stress to the Spanish economy. The law of supply and demand states that the value of a commodity is relative to its scarcity. The less there is of something, the greater its value. The inverse is also true, and the flood of Spanish silver into the global economy diluted its buying power. The Spanish responded to this decline in value by mining ever greater amounts, which of course only exacerbated the situation. Finally, the flow of silver misrepresented the strength of the Spanish economy. Lenders were more than happy to extend credit to the Spanish crown, confident that Spanish silver would settle the debt. The aforementioned inflation reduced the value of the silver, and the Spanish were ultimately unable to pay off the loans, resulting in the crown declaring bankruptcy 4 times at the end of the 16th century. In the long term, the short-sighted reliance on silver mining meant that the Spanish never developed the manufacturing economy necessary for mercantilistic competition. In short, Spain's New World silver acted as a narcotic. It fueled short-term glory and imperial ambition, but dulled the economic instincts that might have built a self-sustaining manufacturing base. Question 9. What was the role of the Catholic Church in the conquest of the Americas? The Spanish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula was framed as a crusade, and Ferdinand and Isabella were as much motivated with spiritual victory as they were with political or territorial. The so-called Reconquista had the full and direct support of the papacy, and as the Spanish state took form, the Church became increasingly embedded in its bureaucracy. To a significant extent, the clergy formed another branch of the state apparatus, although it had other functions and goals as well. When the Spanish invaded the Americas, religious orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits carried out the widespread conversion of the native peoples, establishing churches in the towns and villages, and setting up missions in frontier areas where nomadic groups were forced to settle. Some of the actions of the Church were, at least on the surface, benevolent. The Franciscan priest Bernardino de Sahagún became an expert in the Nahuatl language, composing a bilingual encyclopedia of Aztec culture in the process. Other clerics wrote histories, grammars, and studies of native language and culture. At other times, the church was brutal, as in the case of the Bishop of Yucatan, Diego de Landa, who so detested the Maya religion that he burned all their books and tortured many Maya suspected of backsliding. The Spanish, and of course the church officials accompanying them, saw the conversion of the people of the Americas as one of their primary goals. Christian missionaries were often the ones who would maintain a presence in a region newly under Spanish control. They would seek out native populations, teaching them Spanish and convincing them to abandon their belief systems. Whether their motivations were genuinely humane or not, the direct imposition of a new culture and religion accelerated the collapse of native culture and society. Where the conquistadors would attack and destroy the physical, secular institutions of the Aztecs, the missionaries would follow closely behind, effectively having the same effect on the language, religion, and culture of the natives. Question 10. What was the relationship between sugar and slavery in Portuguese Brazil? On the basis of a single crop produced by slave labor, Brazil became the first great plantation colony and a model that later was followed by other European nations in their own Caribbean colonies. Even after the Brazilian economy evolved and diversified, the social hierarchy still reflected its plantation and slave origins. The white planters became a new aristocracy and blended with the upper merchant class and the few Portuguese state officials to create a dominant ruling class. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the slaves, distinguished by their skin color as property. Over time, the miscegenation of people from American, European, and African origins produced a mixed-race class that fulfilled the artisanal, independent farming, and free labor roles. As a result of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, the Portuguese were entitled to all of the land they found east of a certain line of longitude. This meant that the only land in South America that the Portuguese could claim was the easternmost part of modern-day Brazil. This land was initially considered to be worthless and was more or less a backwater as the Portuguese focused their efforts on the slave and spice trade. When the sugar boom began in the middle of the 16th century, the once dismissed Brazilian territory was now a valuable source of imperial wealth, prompting a massive influx of slave labor from Africa. Sugar was the raison d'etre for the slave plantation economy, and thus for the entire society described previously. Question 11. What were the Bourbon reforms? Were they a plan for long-term success? The Bourbons were a European royal dynasty originating in France. In Spain, they came to power in the early 1700s after the War of Spanish Succession, when Philip V, grandson of France's Louis XIV, became king. This ushered in a new ruling family with a distinctly French-influenced, centralized style of governance. The Bourbon reforms were a broad series of political, economic, military, and administrative reforms carried out by Spain's Bourbon monarchs, especially Charles III, throughout the 18th century. Their goals were to modernize the empire, increase efficiency, and reassert royal control over its far-flung American colonies. The reforms aimed to centralize administrative control of the colonies. They replaced Creole, that is, American-born Spanish, officials with peninsulares, Spanish-born administrators, to strengthen royal authority. The Bourbons also restructured the economy, opening up colonial trade and improving tax collection to increase revenue. They modernized the military, creating local militias and fortifying defenses to protect against European rivals. Significantly, the Bourbons, not having the same close relationship with the Church as had their predecessors, reduced the power and influence of the Catholic Church, as evidenced by their expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767. Finally, the Bourbons sought to avoid the same economic short-sightedness that had plagued their predecessors, encouraging new industries, mining reforms, and agricultural improvements. All told, the focus of the Bourbon reforms on the institutes of state signaled that they were indeed a plan for long-term success.